We'll call the May 15th, 25 Planning Board meeting to order. Let's open with prayer. Gracious Heavenly Father, Lord, we love you, Lord. Thank you for loving us, Lord. We thank you for this beautiful day, Lord. We thank you for this beautiful weather that's coming this weekend and the events that are going on in our community, Lord. Be with us as we do business in the town, Lord. May everything we say and do be pleasing to you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Let us stand for the pledge.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I would like to recognize Sky, Wade, and Lisa called and said they were not going to be able to make it tonight. So we'll move on to our first agenda item. You should have received the minutes earlier this week and had time to review those. I will entertain a motion to approve those as presented.
I make a motion.
I have a motion. Second.
Did you hear that? She spoke so softly, I could hardly hear her, but you know.
So I have a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, like sign. Motion carries. Second agenda item is to nominate a new vice chair. So does anybody have a burning desire to be the vice chair? Or know somebody who does?
Now's a good time to nominate one of those three people.
That's right.
Here, right?
Pay the price for not being here, right?
I'll nominate Wade then. Wade Larry.
And ETJ, I'm asking, ETJ can be vice chair. Okay.
I'll second it.
So we have a motion and a first and a second. Any discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed, like sign. Congratulations, Wade. You won't miss no more meetings. Agenda item 3, I will turn over to Sean for presentation.
All right, I hope everybody's doing well tonight. Get my microphone set up here. And I thought tonight we'd have a little bit more of an informal conversation, but what I can do is go through there's I think 4 different discussion items, and I'm prepared to provide the board with some of the feedback that I gave with the driving nail in a conversation that I had with them last week in terms of their suggestions and just general staff feedback. But tonight just as information to the board, we have spent some time going through what other places are doing, maybe what they're doing well, maybe what they're not doing well. We've talked about CAMA communities, we've talked about MS4 communities, we've talked about the pros and cons that are associated with each type of those regulations. We've talked about some of the challenges we faced at White Lake and runoff and the stormwater that is generally full of nutrients that does affect our water chemistry. And to bring all that to a head, tonight we're going to start working on what our draft ordinance is going to look like. So the 4 topics that I just mentioned to you, I request feedback from the board on each topic. And to be clear, there may not be any or may be very little, and that's perfectly okay. Again, I'll frame it by giving you my feedback to the driving nail and then ask if there's any additional feedbacks. We'll take this feedback, again, for lack of a better term, tonight to the planning team, and then they will continue to shape that draft. So, and we'll talk about what that looks like at the conclusion of the presentation. So we'll get started on the first item you see there in your packet for discussion. It's the stormwater applicability. And what that means basically is you've got 3 different classifications. First classification being single family, 2 family, 3 family, residential type projects. The second classification being low density, that does not meet the definition of the aforementioned residential projects. And then the last classification being high density, which, as you see there, exceeds the low density threshold. So the low density proposed threshold in this text is that if it's a non-residential property, at least single family, two family, or three family residential, that is draining to the lake, it can be considered a low density project if the built upon area is less than or equal to 12%. Otherwise, no more than 2 dwelling units per acre or less than 24% built upon area for all residential and non-residential development. These are all kind of a fancy way of saying a business use primarily at White Lake. That's again, non-residential, at least non-residential from a multifamily or a mixed-use development standpoint. That does not meet 12% or more built upon area. And then high density is anything that doesn't meet those two classifications. So this was proposed as a way of looking at what works best for White Lake. We've talked about it a lot. The zoning code of White Lake is sort of like putting a square peg in a round hole. There's a lot of non-conforming lots that exist across the lake just simply because of the development that took place at the lake prior to the zoning code being adopted. So as things are developed, staff does work with our citizens and customers, if you want to look at it from that framework, to try and do what makes the most sense. So for our conversation tonight, I want to make sure the planning board is thinking along the lines of what makes the most sense. I don't think we can come up with a short definition that encompasses every household or every built upon area at the lake. But I want to let you know that's where I think this is a good opportunity for some flexibility in the definition so that staff has the opportunity to discuss with potential proposed developer or proposed citizen for a project to try and do what makes the most sense for their project. I will also tell you that a minimum impervious addition of 100 feet was explained by the by the planning engineering company as basically anything that would be greater than a 10 by 10 addition to an existing property. And that's a way of trying to catch some of the existing property, but not be so restrictive that existing property owners could not adhere to the stormwater ordinance, or again, it just would not make sense for our community. And it's important to point out in these discussion items for stormwater applicability that landscaping activities involving no impervious surface are allowed without a permit. There's no restrictions placed on this. So as a conclusion, I know I'm being repetitive when I say this for this discussion item, but this is meant to serve as a starting point primarily. Definitions that are loose by design, but give staff flexibility and allow citizens and staff to work together to do what makes the most sense. Of course, with any type of code, you can always come back and amend that code or change it as time moves on, primarily in retroactiveness to events that are taking place. So I just like to kind of throw that in there as a disclaimer. In other words, what you're doing tonight or what you're suggesting tonight or what we're ultimately suggesting for adoption is not set in stone. This is a living, breathing document, so just keep that in mind too. Having said that, is there any discussion from the planning board on that first topic for applicability?
I do have a question. Remind me, I know it's probably a simple definition, built upon area.
Yes.
Is that total for per acre, or is it like it says total built upon acre is greater than 12%? So that would be 12% of that acre is built on.
Of the parcel.
Okay, 12% of the parcel.
Yes.
Okay.
Because you're going to find a couple, especially on the White Lake Drive side and 701 side of the lake, you'll find some pieces of property that may exceed that acre. So our definition is per property.
Okay.
And built upon area would be any type of structure or really impervious surface.
So an impervious driveway, like a cement driveway, counts as built upon area.
It does. As a form of impervious surface, and I'm glad you asked that question. I did want to point out that on some of those aforementioned lots, you may have long driveways that would or could be factoring into that 12%.
Okay.
or excuse me, 12% definition. And 12% is taken from the North Carolina Stormwater Design Manual. We could certainly look at adjusting that, but in trying to keep things somewhat standard with the North Carolina definitions that already exist, that is the recommendation.
When Withers Ravenel did this, did they take examples of existing places and see how and if they fit?
Absolutely.
And do they?
They do.
Many, like,
They do. And there is a section we'll get to just a little bit farther down that proposes potential possibility for lots that are not able to fit in that. Because again, it gets back to some lot sizes already being non-conforming, and then lots that are the primary structure, or the structure, I should say, on the lot are already probably more than 75% built-up area of that lot. So there are certain cases where it does not, but generally speaking, we did find that by and large, it did work. And one reason, I'm sorry, if I could, one reason that we did, or we are recommending the state design manual is because while we look at the stormwater ordinance as a whole, a lot of language and a lot of guidance that's coming down from the state of North Carolina through the regulatory agencies or the grant funding agencies are requesting this be in place now as a way of community involvement or skin in the game, community level, to have conversations and ultimately applications for grant funding. So that's another reason why we want to, or why we are recommending that we tie it closely to that stormwater control design manual, so that if there's any updates there, it naturally makes sense to come back and update our language. But this is a case where I think as a planning board and ultimately board of commissioners can say, we're not going above and beyond. We recognize that this may be restrictive to some people. We have some measures in the ordinance that give you a way around it. There may be a fee associated with it, there may not be. However, it ties into state documentation because that's what's being recommended by the school government, North Carolina municipalities, NCDQ, et cetera, as best practice. And even there are discussions in the General Assembly right now about mandatory stormwater control measures, especially on this side of the state, because most water is running towards us as it makes its way across the state. It may not be running directly to White Lake, but you understand what I'm saying.
Right.
With eastern North Carolina running towards the ocean. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Yeah, on the Withers Ravenel, they're talking about exemptions to the vegetative buffer, an 8-foot dock. What is that?
So that was discussion item number 2.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Jumping ahead.
Yeah, I wanted
Okay,
to go through, we
Okay.
can certainly move on to number 2 if there are no more questions about applicability.
Oh, wait, well, on the goal, so another question, then the goal of enacting the stormwater ordinance is to reduce nutrients to the lake. What about, things for like the downspouts of houses that run into the lake, draining parking lots,
Sure.
go to the lake,
I would say this is meant to be a starting point for new development.
Okay.
I will tell you, staff is already working with Secretary of State Parks and state parks in general, as it is like the lake is owned by the state park system, in terms of how to address that for existing conditions. There are no more new conditions allowed, or no more. I think there's a catch-all phrase in the general statutes that talks about raising the elevation of the lake and discharging into the lake, or illicit discharge into the lake. But the state has not come up with a set of parameters yet to address existing conditions. So staff is working with that, and certainly I'm happy to keep the planning board informed of that progress. The stormwater ordinance by and large is going to be aimed at new development or development that exceeds that 100 square foot, 10 by 10 room addition, or some type of addition to the footprint exceeding that 100 square foot threshold.
and is 100 square foot too small? You know what I mean? Because honestly, it's like, that's a shed, which I get, we still need permits for all that kind of stuff. But I feel like it's like, hey, Town of White Lake, here's a bunch of work for y'all to do. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, how are you even gonna know that somebody built something that small? You know, I don't know. Like, I feel like if it's a little bit bigger, it would make a little more sense than just the 10 by 10, but I understand that everything adds up. Like, I just don't want to be a burden on staff to be like, oh my goodness, you know, like, yes, of course, this is gonna be approved. You know what I mean? Because it's so,
Well, sure, and I think that's a great point. I would tell you that any shed does require a zoning permit currently,
mm,
so that process has already taken place. Now, whether or not 10 by 10 is too small, that's feedback, I can certainly take that to them being, where they're driving nails, they have designs. That too is pulled from the stormwater design manual. That's a common thing tonight, but that's certainly something that could be adjusted.
because I would look at our, you know, when you add on a porch, you know, you gotta have a certain amount of distance anyway, like, you know, so maybe to take into those to say, okay, anything smaller than that is gonna be not worth your time, or, but again, it's one of those things like you get somebody somewhere that's gonna be like, well, here's 10 foot, here's 100 square foot right here, and the next year, here's another 100 square foot, you know?
Let me propose something back to you on.
Yeah.
What about 15 foot? Or one side greater than 15 foot? I'm getting that language from the building code.
Mhm, yeah, that's what I'm saying, yeah, about, I think that would be a little more on your radar a little bit too, because again, working with the county to say you got to have a deck of a certain size anyway, you know, to meet whatever requirements. And I think that would work in tandem together to be like, hey, you go to the building inspector and they're going to say, hey, go to White Lake and make sure you get everything done over there too. You know what I mean? And again, there's little mobile sheds and stuff like that, which if they're not tied to the ground, I think that's the thing that you don't have to have a permit for or something like that too, or.
No, I want to be clear on that since this is a recorded meeting, both a deck and a shed do require a zoning permit.
Okay.
Our existing zoning code.
Okay.
They're accessory uses.
But you know, there are a lot of people that do this on the weekend when they come to visit and then they scoot right on back out of town. And unless,
That's a whole separate conversation.
oh yeah, okay, sorry about it. But that happens a whole lot.
And we are limited, and sometimes we do rely on citizen feedback as part of that process. But strictly speaking to the zoning code, it is a permit, or a permit is required regardless of whether or not. This would just follow, if the board wanted to move forward 15 foot, that would follow with the building code to give you a little bit more flexibility. It'd be, I guess, 150 foot, so 100 square.
Mhm. But just, again, it's just feedback to say, let's make it worth our while to not have to nickel and dime on how much is it really going to help for impervious surface stuff. You know what I mean? That's what I'm saying, like, make it worth their effort.
Okay, I'll certainly pass that along. For the second topic, the lake buffer. This was a topic, I'll tell you, that in my mind, I think of it as, are we all familiar with the KISS method? Keep it simple, stupid. There's a couple of things that are listed here, and they all could be great in terms of specific use cases. But for a starting point, again, that's what this is. It's a starting point. It can be amended over time, but something that we can implement in our community with a high likelihood of success rate in terms of implementation as well as public buy-in. I think we get into a conversation about what makes sense and what doesn't. So as you see in your packet, we have discussed potential 10-foot vegetative buffer. Now, a vegetative buffer, just so you know, is defined as in the stormwater design manual, grass or other vegetation. There was some conversation, although brief, about specific vegetation types, being native vegetation or non-native vegetation. As staff feedback, I feel like that may be too restrictive, especially in the beginning process. But that'd be pretty restrictive in general. So my feedback was, and if the planning board agrees, it's great. If not, we'll certainly discuss it. But there's a 20-foot buffer that already exists on lakefront property as a setback. My feedback was, if we want to do something basic as a starting point, why not look at something like a 25-foot setback? We're getting 5 feet farther from the lake, but reduce that 5 feet on the front setback. for lakefront property, which would be a 15-foot instead of a 20-foot setback off of town-owned roads. So that the same amount of space on the property is still available for that potential development. But you are a little bit farther away from the lake, and therefore, in turn, you have more beach area, or you have more pervious surface through grass or any other kind of vegetation to potentially pick up some of those nutrients on as they grow, so to speak.
I have a question. When you're talking about native plants for this area, do you have like a list of people when they're wanting to build? That you could give to them and say, hey, these would be acceptable built, you know, to put in the area close?
We don't, but I would say that part of our conversation with Willie Ravenel, and one of the things I want to mention before, we certainly could put language in the stormwater ordinance that suggested it, but not recommended or not required. And if we did something like that, then certainly we could develop this like they're speaking of to make that process a little bit easier on an applicant.
Yeah, our extension office really focuses on corn and soybeans and different things like that. I know that our extension office in Raleigh and Durham, I mean, it's important, but it's what our area is, right? But in Raleigh and Durham, I mean, they really do focus on, you know, native pollinators and this and that and the other, and they do have a whole list, but that's in the Piedmont, and they're, you know, could be in a little bit different area than we are.
Right.
My feedback on the buffer zone, I mean, at our property over here, I mean, we've got like 40 feet from one of our mobile homes to the front. And honestly, because sometimes, you know, the beach area sloped towards the lake, when we get the inundation of water that we just had this past weekend, I mean, even at 40 foot, we have water that just sheets off and goes to the lake. And again, I think, you know, the change from 2025 is a little bit like, what are we really gaining for the effort that we're putting into it? My recommendation would be, instead of just doing the bigger, you know, 5 foot, which is only 5 foot, 5 foot is going to help for sure. But like I said, I mean, we got 40 feet. You can just come look at my beach area and see where the water would just channel and cut to the lake anyway. And so, I mean, doubling it didn't even do anything at all, you know what I mean, to prevent stormwater runoff. And so, you know, one of the things that I was going to do is, you know, try to do those swales. And again, Janae talking about native stuff, I was going to try to do some, you know, grasses to help slow down the water to go in. But I don't know that adding 5 foot is going to do anything, practically speaking, but maybe some swales would, and that native vegetation, which, you
So
know.
what if you did 30 feet?
But that's what I'm saying. I'm at 40 already, and it's
I
not
know,
doing anything,
but a lot of people are not even close to that.
yeah.
I would say too, last weekend, I mean, that's a heavy rain.
Yeah.
But that's what we're preparing for, right? I mean, that's the
Not
whole,
necessarily.
right.
I've had that conversation of just like when we put town infrastructure in the ground, you can only get us so big. I mean, can't be prepared for everything. But I think any type of maybe normal rain or rain outside or extreme events would be something that I would say would be applicable here.
and then the other feedback was on the vegetative buffer. If grass is considered a vegetative buffer, it's like, you know, people love the grass. I tend to hate it. Because you got to cut it and people fertilize it and stuff like that. And I would feel like the danger there would be, hey, I've got grass in the lake, you know, let's fertilize it, fertilize it, you know, whatever. Yeah, I can't say it right now. But, and the danger there would be just, you know, nutrient runoff just for trying to make their grass grow, you know, close to the vegetative buffer. So again, it's like, you know, we do a plus minus to be like, hey, you know, vegetative buffer is going to prevent, you know, whatever.
And I think that does fall some on the staff in terms of public education. I will tell you there are some general statutes when you start talking about restricting fertilizer or establishing any type of restricted area that prohibit that. However, again, public education is going to be something that would help fill the gap, so to speak, in terms of just letting people know when you are fertilizing up to the edge of your property that is lakefront, of course, there's going to be some runoff concerns. Whether or not they adhere to that, public education is next.
What about with the seawalls? Then, people go right up to it with their loads. I'm sorry, but they do.
They do. And I'm not as familiar with walls, seawalls, just in full transparency. Grass, I would say, is still a form of pervious surface, so there is something to be gained there.
But on some of these seawalls, you'll see where you have where people put drains going out to the lake.
Oh, absolutely. And again, the town has identified there are multiple drains around the lake that exist. And I think getting back to Jonathan's point, staff is gonna continue to work with cemetery state parks, and maybe state parks as a whole, the regulatory side, but that language is nowhere close to being ready. I think there's just all kinds of concerns. And a lot of it is false on existing property owners, because that water is already, in some ways, designed to go there. So when you take that away, where's the water gonna go? Now we start talking about hydrological trespassing or potential ill gain effects on property and repetitive loss and all this stuff. So, but again, I'll certainly keep you or somebody on my staff. That's a plan on the progress of that is what to share in terms of regulations for existing. I do want to point out too, on this buffer conversation, that there is a little passage about non-conforming lots. And if a hardship could be demonstrated, there are certainly some lots around the lake that are not going to come close to being this. Not all, again. To Hope's points, there definitely is some, there's a lot of lots that will be conforming when looking at GIS and using the GIS measuring tool. But not all. So we could, as a planning board, essentially look at an annual fee that would be assessed in addition to a lake management fee if you chose to go that route, just as a way of everybody contributing. So.
And what was the 8-foot dock thing again?
That's an exclusion.
Yeah, but I mean, like, what is an 8-foot dock? Is it 8 foot wide or something like that? Is it here or?
Yeah,
like-
I think that comes from the building code as well, or maybe it comes from I'll follow up again, because I don't want to tell you the wrong thing, but it comes from a source of 8 foot wide, I do believe.
Okay.
What they're getting at, but beach area, of course, is also going to be for, so the beach area is also excluded from that.
With an 8-foot wide dock, you know how a lot of folks will have your pier is an 8-foot wide pier, and you just have your like walkway is an 8-foot wide walkway that comes up to your house to walk out on, so that you're not on grass, you're on the pier.
I see.
too.
It's like a walkway,
Yeah.
but it's not, because like, to me, a dock is like a pier, you know what I mean? Like, so that's why I was like, what's an 8-foot dock? Like, but again, Within Raven Arrow's like, hey, it's a dock, for us, and we're like, it's a walkway, So
I don't
as long as
know.
we're, consistent with
Clarity would be
on
nice.
on what they
Clarity would
want.
be nice, an illustration or a picture.
Yeah,
Some of us need all the help we can get.
Because in our zoning book, they did take, go around, they take pictures, and they're like, here's an example of an R1, here's an example of an R2, here's business one, so that one might be nice too, to be like, here's what we're talking about.
I actually have a whole request for the planning board.
Okay.
Along those lines.
Okay.
So we can bring our crayons and stuff.
Sure, yeah. But was there any more feedback on that topic?
So if
I
it
heard
was
this.
if it was set back 30,
Right.
what would 5 feet from the road?
I don't know that you can get much closer to 15. Now, but it'd be 10, not exactly. It's a
So
10.
10. Okay.
But that would be for a new development, basically. So if somebody's coming in and
Yeah.
saying, hey, I'm a new kid on the block. I don't, I've got this wooded lot. It's on the lake. But the lot's small and I can't build because of the buffer at the front. So we're gonna push it towards the back. That's basically what it is. But it's not like a pre-existing that's like, hey,
Build tall.
yeah.
Yeah, it'd be redevelopment or new development.
How many lots on the water do we have left that's
This is.
not been developed?
Like
Yeah.
8.
It's probably. And that's why I say it'd be tough to go 10 foot, because
Mhm.
you really want consistency in that zoning code. As part of just protection of property, protection of rights, but establishing commonalities. So if you've got one that's 10 foot, and one that's 20 foot, that may create, or start to create some inherent problems. but even 15 foot. More than would be 30 foot. And there's still almost lots still all there.
Well, my biggest sticking point is if the ultimate goal is to reduce nutrient load to the lake. Like, that's what I would want them to show, to say that these rules would be effective to reduce the nutrient load to the lake. And that's all I'm saying, you know, the 5 extra foot from 2025. In my experience, that's not gonna reduce the nutrient load, because at 40 foot, 30 foot, whatever, I still think that it would be, like, we're gonna have to have some type of, like the swells or the whatever, or something mechanically, or something that you're gonna have to do different other than just having a rule. It's gotta be a little more specific, I think.
Well, and I think one of the things that Sean has pointed out earlier is this is a starting point. And we can adjust as we go down the road. And I remember one of the presentations that the local government folks did a year and a half ago, or however long it's been. There was not one thing that they could point and said, oh, this is the cause. It was a myriad of a bunch of different things. So I think if we do kind of the same thing on the other side and say, do some stuff here, do some stuff here to try to help the situation, I think that's a good place to start. And then we can tweak as we go, as we see we need to do something different. I think that's a good place to start.
My only counter to that is, you know, when we were doing the 160D, we had a lot of definitions that we got a lot of work to do for sure at White Lake for planning and zoning. But we always punt it down the road to be like, oh, we'll start here and we'll fix it later. But for me,
Yeah,
I'm
we'll come back
like,
and
if we're
fix it.
talking about it now, let's get the specifics now and get it right the first time, instead of having to redo it later, you know, for something that may or may not work. Like, cause I don't want regulation just to have regulation.
Right.
I want it to be really effective, and brainstorming should be, hey, this will work and it will reduce whatever, you know what I mean? And I want it to be successful, not just to say, we checked off a thing that says, hey, we got a plan, we got, you know, whatever, but the plan was not effective. You know what I mean? Like, where anybody, like, I don't know, that's all I'm saying.
Well, for this is just for new or redevelopment. This isn't existing.
Yeah.
So what you're mainly talking about, you're gonna have to include in existing. So, but I think if we did the 30 feet and then the 10 feet towards the road, at least that's a start.
So I think it's 25. I think it's only adding 5 feet, right? Or
I would like the 25.
from 20 to 25 versus.
Yeah, that, I feel like.
Because that doesn't include the beach, right? That doesn't include the sand, right?
Right.
But then if you have
Yeah.
sand, that's more. So
Right.
But you'd still have minimum setback for your building anyway, due to the building code. So even with from the distance between, you just say it's a driveway, or, you know, because we're not always talking about White Lake Drive. I mean, it could just be somebody's street or whatever. You've only got a building lot so big anyway, you know, of. Yeah, they are small.
25
Yeah.
foot lots.
Some of these lots are really.
Really small.
Really.
Hopefully in the redevelopment and stuff, or whatever, new development, they'll put it in that small. To get away from those.
Well, the
rules.
zoning code does establish a minimum lot size, so if there is redevelopment taking place and there's an opportunity to do that, it's certainly something we consider and work with. But again, as I started off the conversation, this is gonna be a work in progress, and I think it's really important for the planning board to allow staff to continue to work with our developers and our projects on a case-by-case basis, so that it makes the most sense and we get the most bang for our buck at that individual site, instead of just one thing that may be restricted for everything. In other words, one size is not gonna fit.
right.
One thing you mentioned, I think I heard, and see if this is right. Even though this is a starting point and it may not be exceptionally effective in the grand scheme of what we're trying to achieve with better lake water, if we have this in a stormwater ordinance established that is somewhat conformed to the state regs, whenever we're applying for help from the state, grant, or special help from the General Assembly for something that we want or need, if we can establish that, yes, look what we're doing. We are being proactive. We have done this. We've tried to set it up like this. It adds to our case to help us perhaps get some help
Mhm.
later on. Is that, do I
Absolutely.
understand that to be right?
In terms of establishing stormwater infrastructure, or in terms of giving that water that's already flowing toward Lake somewhere else to go, then coming back with this and adding on to it, I think that would be probably the best way to do it. Like, you're not talking about something that's gonna be done tonight, tomorrow, next week. But I would agree with that statement. This is necessary, if not mandatory, for those type of conversations. Do exactly what illustrated, really proving to not just funding sources, but regulatory agencies that we are doing our part. We are trying to think proactively. We're looking into the future. It's small steps, but 25 feet is greater than 20, 30 feet is greater than 20. And that 20 foot, I heard you say is part of the building code, it's actually part of the zoning code, it's a setback. But that's where you can't have any type of structure that's 20 feet or closer. So making that 25 foot is still beneficial to the cause, because you got 5 feet to work with, right? For new development.
So what would be a pre-existing non-conforming lot versus redevelopment? So let's just say that there is a lot on a certain street. They had a house that they took off. The lot is too small to build on because the rules have changed, right? So then does somebody say, hey, I've got a non-conforming lot? How does the new rules help? Because we've got a rule that says if you're non-conforming, we'll make it happen. You see what I'm saying? It's
Well,
like,
actually, I think that's where something like that fee comes into play.
yeah,
Because even though they may not be contributing in hurting the surface, they would still be, there'd be some type of monetary contribution that could parlay into a stormwater infrastructure project or some type of beneficial project for the lake, utilizing those lake management.
but then that's my point was, what would be the point of even having the rule? If, never mind the rule, we can do it so long as we throw some money at it. You see what I'm saying? Like, it
It's
just kind
almost a
of,
carrot and stick situation,
Yeah.
I think, because I don't know what the fee would be, that's to be determined, but if it's your lot and you're thinking about, okay, this house finally fell down or whatever, we gotta do something else with it, but I'd like to have, I don't wanna not have a place at the lake. If you say, yes, we're gonna work with you because it's a non-conforming lot. But part of that is you're gonna have to pay, will it be an annual fee or is it a one-time
Annual.
fee? You're gonna have to consider every year, if I do this, if I rebuild on here, or I renovate or whatever and keep this, every single year, I'm gonna have to pay this fee because I'm non-conforming, because I'm not contributing to the buffer that everybody else is. So it's a little stick.
So would they have to
to
pay a
say.
management fee too?
Right.
It'd be like the lake management fee is now,
Okay.
it's like $2 per structure per month. Although that fee is proposed annually, maybe something. I think to take that one step farther, we certainly don't want to prohibit anybody from coming to White Lake and enjoying White Lake. I don't think that's the purpose of the zoning code. But we certainly want to make sure everybody's playing the same sandbox.
Mhm.
I'll tell you about the same rules.
I'm giving you a hard time. Go ahead.
Well, I've taken some of that feedback, or written some of that feedback back down, and we'll continue to work on that buffer zone. Number 3, or the third topic I want to hit briefly, you'll see some text there in terms of reducing runoff pollution in the lake for an erosion and sediment control ordinance. That is not going to be something that we're going to tackle in this original proposal. This is something that we want to illustrate for the purposes of having a vision, a place to go, coming back to and working on. We have talked about potentially putting something on there that would, as you see in the bullet point, be specifically for new and redevelopment projects. That would be lakefront. That would be something, I think the way it's written here is drain to the lake, certainly lakefront. Something as simple as a silt fence or a stone construction entrance. It's a way of starting to capture it, but the stormwater control, the sediment control ordinance is something that ultimately I feel like is best if we come back to. And I just want to bring that to your attention tonight. And again, I think that's not to belittle the point or belabor the point, but I think that's something that staff has an opportunity to work with the applicant individually make recommendations to, make suggestions to, and certainly, provide feedback when asked on how they can minimize their impact to the lake via their project. But just one point out. And also on the list of discharge, I do want to make the planning board aware, there is some regulation that already exists in the wastewater management side of the equation. Specifically as one example, the grease program for restaurants. We have to keep up when they're collecting grease and what we're doing with that grease. Essentially making sure we're keeping it out of our system. So some of that is already taking place. Don't feel like we're not doing anything about it, but it is often part of this conversation. I think it's best sort of come back to that part of the conversation. On existing lots, the rebates, we discussed briefly, because I know it came up in the last meeting, that we could do a rebate program potentially for people that were doing stormwater control measures or voluntarily adding benefit from their property to the lake to reduce runoff and that type of thing. Gets back to the town staff restrictions. I'm not sure we've got the staff in place. Look at every single piece of property and fairly implement a rebate program. Or I'm not sure we've got the staff to be able to go through 3,000, we've got 3,000 utility accounts, so 3,000 applications requesting rebates. And because of that, again, something that can be mentioned as a vision for the future. I don't know what that looks like in full transparency, but I do want to let the board know that through the agriculture extension program, there is something called a community conservation assistance program. I'm not prepared to discuss that tonight. It may be a way of getting some of that buy-in and providing monetary value. You see it outlined some of the new program there. Essentially, from a 30,000-foot view, that any type of pre-approved best management practice or stormwater control measure would be up to a 75% refund through that state one program. It would be managed at the town level and managed at the state level. I do want to get some more information on that. I'd like to give you all an example of what that might look like, and if we would implement that, we certainly could. That would be something we're going to that could be a potential carry for somebody that's looking to get involved and looking to make a difference. And lastly, I mentioned the homework. Withers Revenue has requested that staff provide some examples of properties that are already conducting stormwater management. They would like to put some illustrations for examples in our main or in our ordinance as part of our zoning code. I mentioned to them, just to kind of get you thinking about it, but I mentioned to them that Summer Winds developed a retention pond at the back of their property. They actually select their property toward that retention pond. I also mentioned that there are some businesses that have French drains installed. I think Resort Relations has some.
Well, I mean, we've got one.
Yes, right. Yeah, this is which is the main
Holiday Resort.
Holiday Resort. Yeah. And then they went as far as saying any property really with downspout disconnect or rain garden would be applicable. But if you can think of any, please let me know or send me a photo, and I'll make sure that we add that to our library of examples. Some way we'll come up with a way to illustrate that, because I do think that's important. People are looking online. As you mentioned, all of our zoning code districts have pictures associated with that 30,000-foot view to let potential property owners know what can go in and what can't go in. And we're going to continue that motion.
Or rain, like a rain barrel on a residential gutter system, is that something? Is it? Tony Evans has them at her house over at Shady Shores.
Okay.
And how about businesses that have a wide buffer and non-reduced or very little pervious materials anywhere near their beachfront?
Absolutely. I think
It's-
again,
We've got a 60-foot wide beach, or it's at least 40 feet. It may not be that wide. It's a wide, we have a very wide white sand beachfront, and then we have a large area that's non-pervious. It's grass and dirt. I wish it was something other. I mean, I wish we've searched for something that is safe and good for the environment and attractive and that, you know, vehicles can drive on, and we try to grow vegetation there, but it's so hard with, but it's not pervious. Like
Right.
it's natural materials for a long way before you ever reach the waterfront at our place.
And I would take that a step farther and argue an example, but the example you gave, an example you're talking about, Colorado Resort. From a staff perspective, when you really start to take that quality and that clarity in the conversation, that's actually a function of both ways. You're getting natural area for runoff, and even though it may, during some rain events, exceed that, quicker than it can absorb that. It's also giving the lake a chance to flush itself out as well, especially on the can't Cooler and all the phenomenal job maintaining that beach and raking that beach, and there's a lot of benefit there. So those would be great examples, in my opinion, about putting illustrated to a special potential business on the effect that they could have.
Homework too.
Got some good pictures.
We can get.
So just in conclusion, our next meeting is scheduled for June 19th. That's also the next time that I'm scheduled to meet with Billy Driving now on all these talking points. It's my understanding they're working on draft ordinance. I will tell you, they're going to be reviewing footage from tonight. They reviewed last month's footage as well. And I think either in June or potentially maybe meeting shortly thereafter, we'll have Billy Driving here to present, to answer questions, to give the board a chance to interact with them. Certainly receiving public comments if there are any that exist in terms of how we construct it, but that'll be more toward the actual instead of the discussion. So we can have a presentation about what's in it, what's not in it, why we do this, why we not do that, just a summary of this whole process. Any questions about that? Well, the next meeting of June 19th, I do want to let you know from a staff perspective, we have received a special use permit application. I was going to just say 60 days that they have to do. So June 19th. Special use.
I got one more question for you. For the streets that the town has where there's runoff that goes on, you know, like,
Yeah.
Is there things that the town can do to, you know, take the lead also to be like, hey, you know, we've got a lot of runoff from this street and here's what we're doing. You see what I'm saying? Like, instead of just,
Lead by
Yeah.
example.
yeah,
That is an
you know.
incredibly hard conversation. The reality is almost every stormwater control measure that exists in White Lake is a ditch. Those ditches are privately owned. Then that gets into, and just giving you the full transparency of the context, but that gets into spending taxpayer dollars on privately owned land and benefit gain thereof. We've discussed the opportunity, especially in low-lying areas, for potential maintenance easements, or conversations with property owners about maintenance easements. I can tell you that myself and my public works director, really my public works staff, have been looking high and low for grant funding that could help us move water. But when it comes to, especially the Highway 53 side for the Turtle Cove section, examples, that's going to require pumps. It looks like just from very preliminary engineering works that we've received. So pumping water is more restrictive, of course, for natural means of watershed. And then we've got the conversation of wetlands that are around. So there's a lot that goes into that. It makes it an incredibly difficult conversation to have. But I share that with you and let you know that yes, we're always interested if there's an opportunity that exists. And we're certainly trying to be proactive in our line of thinking of both funding that's available and implementations that we could do to lead by example and increase public buy-in for the opportunity. I think the ultimate goal is to establish a stormwater infrastructure system around the lake, even if it's a partial one. If it's partial, it's better than nothing. And certainly that would have a big benefit in terms of moving water away from the lake. But there's some major topography challenges and just infrastructure that's already existing, setbacks and buffer zone requirements that exist. So we're working through all that, but we're in infancy stages of that. I mean, it's just not something that's really been on the radar, best I can tell in the past. So we're at the beginning of that conversation more so than we are in the middle.
Well, I was thinking more, the one spot that I was thinking of was, honestly, at the end of William Street, where it's now got a gravel area that runs. And where before it was just beach area. And again, there's always been a swell in between, but now when the water comes down the street, it hits that gravel and it goes right to the lake, pretty fast.
That area is definitely great.
Yeah. So,
Well, thank you.
All right, thank you, sir. Any other business needs to come forward, board?
Motion to adjourn.
well, we got public.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oops.
We do have to open it up to, for public comment, if there is any.
Yeah.
Hearing none,
I make a motion to adjourn, please.
I'll second it.
we are adjourned.
Hey.